Hello, this is Jake Jacobs with Session 1, Part 2 of the Real-Time Strategic Change Practicum, Hitting the Ground Running with your RTSC Practicum project. Now, where we left off was learning from the case. Where do you see the RTSC principles at place in the case story? So remember, these are the RTSC principles, what they look like. We covered these in Session 1 in terms of defining them. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look through the lens of these principles at the work that was done during that 150-person buying meeting before and after it. So we'll start with reality as a key driver, the inside of the organization. Now, one of the things that was in the purpose statement was a realistic assessment of the scope and scale of what's ahead. So this is taking stock to say, what's it going to take from us to make this work? You remember the very detailed documentation that was done and the speed in which it was done also is about inside of the organization. How do we capture the work that we've done so that we can move it forward? The panel, which was in the morning, you recall, after they talked about the strategy, there was the implementation ideas panel, and this was looking at success experiences that had already occurred, again, within the organization. And the onboarding process review, this was one of the things that came out of the planning from the session. They had said we need to do a better job onboarding, and again, that has to do with an internal process or system. Now, what did we do on the outside of the organization? Poll of the reality is a key driver. Well, the strategy and business case was something that was emphasized both in the purpose statement and in the session itself. There was a specific portion of the session set aside to look out at the marketplace and at the strategy. And remember, in terms of what principle was paid more attention to in terms of a poll, they had a more external view of the marketplace than they did inside. So you can see that we weighted things to counteract that in terms of the inside and outside. And the European retail market was another educational piece that was part of the working session. On engaging and including, under providing direction, the actions committed to implement, review further, and not carry forward. Remember, the leadership team had that real-time turnaround in the afternoon where they were asked to take ideas that were given to them by the group and make some decisions right then and there that they would report out in the meeting. The disciplined follow-up with detailed documentation. Again, you can get benefits, credit for working on multiple principles at the same time. We call those high leverage actions across principles. And the strategy was locked in. There wasn't discussion about what the growth strategy was going to be. There was discussion about how to implement it. So inviting participation, the real-time turnaround to the organization-wide planning. Remember again that while the leaders were working on their real-time turnaround, the organization or the people in the room were asked what needed to happen across the organization to make an immediate impact. Posting and voting on the role group work, this was something that was done first thing in the afternoon, you recall. And again, there was participation across each role group to be able to say what were the things that needed to change, what needed to stay the same. And then urgency, energy, and responsibility for success of the effort. This was something that the leadership team and the CEO in particular reached out to people and said, this is something that we all need to be accountable for. Now remember, I talked about the importance of support with that, but in terms of participation, there was a shared accountability for the success of this effort. And broad-based participation and implementation. So this needed to be on everybody's top list, top of mind, make it happen in terms of implementation. There was not direction at that point. It was, how can you help create this collective preferred future? Then in preferred futuring, which comes next, is the best of the past and present and compelling possibilities for the future. So let's look at the past and present. Build on what we've done and accelerate progress. That's straight out of the purpose for the meeting. And you can see that they had that done throughout the meeting because in the role groups, again, changes and keep doing. So this is something to say, what are we already doing well that we want to keep doing in these role groups, and what do we need to change? And then we call them high leverage actions, accelerate and keeping business on track today. So this was something that came out not just in the session, but you recall in the notes from the session coming out from the CEO within a week after the meeting, he talked about how we need to accelerate things, continue to move this agenda forward quickly, but at the same time, keep business on track today, which itself is another polarity I mentioned on the session that we had. It's a speed and quality polarity. And then compelling possibilities for the future. Again, we see that building on what we've done in accelerating progress. This is a high leverage action within a principle. So I had an example across principles. This is one within a principle. The role group changes, again, looked at the changes for the future, and the keep doing was on the past and present. High leverage actions, accelerate and keeping business on track. Again, looking at acceleration as a possibility for the future, and today's business on track was a past and present. So that shows up on both sides of preferred futuring. And move faster in creating our collective future was something that was in the documentation that came out from the CEO. He talked about it, something important. It was discussed in the meeting. So again, this is the preferred futuring principle and how the work that we did showed up on each of these poles or aspects of that principle. Then we look at creating community. So this is the one, remember I talked about the part and whole, and it could be individual people, it could be functions, could be business units, and the whole organization. It could be an individual and the team in which that individual is a member. In this case, we were looking at the buying organization. So basic meeting ground rules. So this is something that you recall they came up with themselves at their own tables for their own meeting, if you will, within this larger gathering. And this was how can we make sure that everybody collectively we're making our best contribution. Let's have some good ground rules. The large group meeting itself was an example of the organization being able to achieve full potential. That question of what could screw up implementation. You remember that was one of the questions that people got to work on. And it was a way of getting at the shadow, getting at the areas that might cause problems and making it okay to name that resistance. In fact, doing it in a way that kind of poked fun at it. This was what could screw up the implementation for the whole organization. And then there was the organization-wide action planning. Near the end of the afternoon, they looked at what can we do that has impact across the entire organization that will have an immediate difference that it'll make. And then the 30-day commitments. So again, you can go back to the design and say, what was it that came out of the leadership team that said there were 30-day commitments? And coming out of that, remember, one of the things had to do with the laptops, which I pointed out, and the screen size and the batteries that it would carry and so forth. But those were 30-day commitments for the organization as a whole. Now, what about individual people? Well, again, ground rules. So I can do my best work and we can do our best work in this meeting by paying attention to both. This onboarding process review that was one of the things that got named as plans for the future. This was on another principle. Here we see it as each individual coming on board can do their best work. And then new laptop computers. So this was one that I had pointed out, each individual having the tools they need to do the work that's required is an example of supporting people achieving their full potential. And then there were individual 30-day commitments. So the leadership was making them for the organization, and each individual was making it for themselves. Thinking and acting in real time, the next principle. So this is planning for your future, being in your future now. So planning for your future looks at the strategy itself is about planning. Focusing on implementation and ideas for accelerating it. Again, it was in the meeting, so they were planning in the meeting for their future. One or two ideas, how to accelerate progress. Again, in the meeting, coming up with ideas and the immediate implementation actions was yet another example of good planning being done by the 150. Being in your future now. So this was one that people had questions about on our session. How do we make that happen? And how can we do more of it? One of the things that I know in paying attention to windows of opportunity, where is it possible to move things further faster? How can I take things that are further downstream typically and move them upstream? So the meeting experience and the follow-up was all about speed. So take a look again at this practice of June 4th to June 26th. So going from having no plans in place to finding a venue, to recruiting a design team, to agreeing on purpose and outcomes, to prepping leaders, all of this work was done within 22 days leading up to that 150-person event. So this notion of talking about doing work faster, implementing faster, creating our future faster, was modeled and experienced in the actual design of this meeting. And I point out again, this was not part of a larger project at this point. This was one piece of work around one large group meeting that then expanded into a system-wide effort. But this whole notion of experiencing our future now, the way the meeting was created was congruent with the way they wanted to do business in the future. And finally, building understanding. This is inquiry and advocacy. The inquiry, there was a question and answer after that strategy and implementation session. The max mix groups, remember I talked about those cross-section groups by function, level, gender, how long tenure they'd been in the organization, the role groups in the afternoon. These were all places where there were questions asked as part of assignments. And so literally just asking the question is about inquiry. Concerns and questions about implementation in the role groups. Now, again, there were opportunities for people to raise issues, to raise concerns, and this is also about inquiry. Questions identified to be answered in the frequently asked questions document. So this was something that at the end of the meeting, you remember they came up with, what else do we need to know more about? And that got identified and got recorded and got responded to. Now in advocacy, where did people take a stand? Well, again, we've got a high leverage action. The strategy and implementation presentations were about advocacy. Max mix tables, the role groups in the afternoon, they came up with answers to these questions and they said in our role group, this is what we need to be standing for. This is the difference we need to make. So it worked on both of those poles or aspects of this principle. And leadership was locked in on the strategy. So not only was it directive in terms of the work that was done and saying that we're going to provide direction here, but there was advocacy. They were saying, let me tell you why we're taking this stand. And let me explain to you why we're making this difference and asking you to join us in creating this collective future. So that gets us another picture of the principles in real-time strategic change and how they showed up in this first step, this first stage of the case study. So I thank you once again for joining and hope this has been helpful. Any questions that you have about this, feel free to put them up in Basecamp for the benefit of the whole cohort. Email me or call me directly if you'd prefer to have them answered that way. Thanks so much, and we'll tune in again on session 2.